There are no old or new, Eastern or Western, first class or second class member countries. We are all just NATO allies, and we stand together as one. Recent events prove that NATO is essential to defending our security and our freedom. This bolsters my conviction that transatlantic military cooperation is still the cornerstone of our collective defense and the foundation of our collective security policy, and that we should therefore keep working to ensure a strong and united NATO, not least in a new global reality. With that in mind, it is simply vital that we talk about the next strategic concept, about how to adapt our alliance to meet today's threats and tomorrow's as well. Threats that may be hybrid in nature or may not even be easily recognizable. This calls for a fresh approach, new instruments and smarter strategies, a robust plan for the next 10 years. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at one crucial element of that plan, our partnerships. Because if we have learned one thing in the past few years, it is that these can determine our success or our failure. We saw this, for example, as a raging pandemic exposed how vulnerable and also interdependent we all are. We see it in the growing security risks posed by climate change. And right now, in Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Our partnerships, old and new, have proved crucial. With the OSCE and the United Nations, with Ukraine and Georgia, with the Western Balkan countries and our Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand and Korea. And above all, the relationship between NATO and the European Union. The current strategic concept called the EU a unique and essential partner for NATO. And now we need to deepen that partnership in the text of the next strategic concept, but also and especially in real life, in practice. That will require simply a major effort. Because the reality is that the EU depends heavily on NATO and the transatlantic bond for our own security. We are certainly not in a position to create an equal and independent alternative, and nor should we try to. But we do need to ensure that the European Union can do more itself, that it can show more readiness and resolve when it comes to security and defense. Former Secretary-General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer is also here with us today. And he recently said, there is no power politics in Europe's DNA. He argued that we badly need that component in today's geopolitical environment. So the challenge is to make sure that European countries develop more military capabilities which can be deployed in different contexts, such as NATO, the EU and coalitions of the willing. We also need to make the EU stronger military through PESCO and the European Peace Facility. This will make us more self-reliant when it comes to guaranteeing security in and around our own territory. And that will also make NATO as a whole stronger. We certainly therefore have a lot to do. And not only in the area of defense cooperation within the EU, but also in the cooperation between the EU and NATO. And that's why the Netherlands is pressing for an ambitious new NATO-EU joint declaration, setting out how we will make this into a reality. Ladies and gentlemen, the current situation makes one thing very clear. We need a solid, united alliance, and we are all responsible for ensuring that. Our starting point should, of course, be strong member countries that do their share and have their armed forces in order. The Netherlands takes that duty seriously. Earlier this month, together with Germany and Norway, we marked the 5-year anniversary of our joint contribution of military personnel to the enhanced foreign presence in Lithuania. And we have just committed to providing F-35 fighter jets that will perform quick reaction alert duties from Bulgaria in response to the Russian threat. In addition, the new Dutch government has agreed a major increase to our defense budget, 10.7 billion euros during this term in office, and a structural increase of 3 billion euros each year. This will bring us a lot closer to the target of 2% of GDP. And not only us, defense spending across the alliance has increased considerably. So, all in all, we can say that NATO is in good shape. And that's largely thanks to your excellent work as Secretary General, dear Jens. Under your leadership, NATO has begun an ambitious modernization process to make us stronger, both politically and militarily. Our allied family has grown to include new members and partners. And that means we can take firm, united action in times of crisis and danger, as is the case today. Jens, we owe you a big debt of gratitude. I look forward to working with you closely in your final 6 months as Secretary General of our alliance. And now, it is my pleasure to give you the virtual floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Rutte. Dear Mark, thank you so much for your kind words and also for your strong leadership and personal commitment to our alliance. And it's great to be here with you all online. Let me also thank the Netherlands and Germany for co-hosting this important seminar today. And I'm delighted that former NATO Secretary General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer is joining this discussion today. Let me also thank Canada, Italy, Portugal and Spain and our partners Finland and Sweden for co-sponsoring this event. This is the third in a series of 4 seminars to help prepare our next strategic concept. And this seminar focuses, as you mentioned, on partnerships. Today, we are facing the most dangerous moment in European security for a generation. Our highly valued partner, Ukraine, remains under imminent threat from Russia. NATO allies are united in their full support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We will continue to provide Ukraine with strong political, practical, and financial support to help Ukraine build their defense capabilities, modernize their defense and security institutions, and uphold their right to self-defense, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. Many NATO allies also provide important bilateral support to Ukraine. And I welcome the recent decision by the Dutch government to provide military equipment to Ukraine to defend itself. There is much at stake in today's crisis. The risk of conflict is real. Russia is using force and ultimatums, not only to redraw borders in Europe, but to try to rewrite the entire global security architecture. Moscow is challenging fundamental principles for our security, like NATO's right to protect and defend all allies, and the right for every nation to choose their own path. This is not only about Ukraine and Georgia, it's also about denying other European countries, like Finland and Sweden, their freedom to choose. Finland and Sweden are 2 highly valued partners bordering the Baltic Sea, with whom we cooperate closely in joint exercises, operations, and political dialogue. The crisis in Ukraine underlines the importance of cooperating with our partners to defend our shared values and security, not least with the European Union. We are working closely together on the current crisis. I speak regularly with my EU counterparts, and NATO allies including Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, are coordinating with the European Union on economic sanctions, as we saw very clearly yesterday. NATO and the European Union are two sides of the same coin. We have different roles, remits, and membership, but what we do is complementary. So while the EU is strengthening all the tools in its toolbox in respect to the current crisis, NATO has enhanced our deterrence and defense across the alliance, with more troops, ships, and planes. We have significantly increased our military presence in the east of the alliance, and we are ready to do even more. I welcome, as you said, Mark, that the Netherlands has increased the readiness of its forces for the NATO response force. It is sending more troops to our multinational battle group in Lithuania and more fighter jets to Bulgaria. This shows that the Netherlands is a highly valued and very committed NATO ally. Beyond the current crisis, NATO and the EU are cooperating in many other areas, from cybersecurity to stability in the Western Balkans and maritime issues in the Aegean. We have lifted NATO EU cooperation to unprecedented levels in recent years, and our ambition is to go even further in new areas like resilience, emerging technologies, and the security impact of climate change. The Netherlands has been a key driver of closer NATO-EU cooperation, including on military mobility. And I thank you, Prime Minister Rutte, for that. NATO's partnerships are fundamental to our ability to preserve peace, promote stability, and increase security for all. They are a two-way street. They help us all adapt to a more contested and competitive world. Over the last 3 decades, NATO has built a broad network of partnerships with countries and organizations near and far, from Finland and Sweden to Colombia and Mauritania, and from the Mediterranean to the Asia-Pacific region. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, NATO's partnerships helped to spread freedom, democracy, and security throughout Europe. Since the 1990s, NATO's operational partners have helped increase stability beyond our borders. And NATO's partnerships remain essential as we continue to adapt to a more dangerous and competitive world today. We also work with many other partners, for example with Iraq, and our partners in the Middle East and North Africa, to stabilize our neighborhood and fight international terrorism. Through our NATO 2030 agenda and the next strategic concept, we are significantly stepping up our training and capacity building support to partners in areas like counterterrorism, crisis management, peacekeeping, and defense reforms. We also want to deepen our existing partnerships and develop new ones, to work with like-minded countries to address the security implications of a more competitive world. Ladies and gentlemen, we are faced with a new normal, a world of rising strategic competition and increasing challenges to our security, where authoritarian powers are seeking to rewrite the global rulebook and demonstrate that might is right. So we face a fundamental question about the world we want to live in. One where big powers dictate what others do through aggression and ultimatums, or a world where everyone is free to choose their own path, able to live in freedom and democracy. This is the world we want, and the one we are working for. We are stronger and safer when we stand together. Thank you so much.
Secretary General, thank you so much for your strong and clear message. And I would like to say to Mark Rutte, our Prime Minister, your message is clear, is strong, and you gave us a lot of fruitful thought in this afternoon's discussion with the audience. Once again, thank you very much to both of you, but to you as well from Brussels. The fact that you're taking time today underlines once again the importance of you as the Secretary General of NATO for the audience. So once again, all the best. Wish them for these days.
Thanks, Jens. I'll speak to you tomorrow.
Thanks again. Well, there's enough food for thought, I would say, to have questions and answers with you from the audience. Prime Minister, you will have time for that, so we're very happy to have you with us for another 10, I think 15 minutes. And it's good to know once again that there will be a similar tomorrow with NATO representatives. I'm looking at the first row here. There's the Dutch representative of NATO, Mrs. Marissa Gerards as well, and some others, policy makers from different ministries. It's very important, I would say, to you as students, and I will encourage you to participate, but also in terms of concrete, out-of-the-box proposals, because that's what's going to work. And you know as students what I mean by that. Saying that and knowing that a few of you will have questions, there's always not a time limit because there's so much time today. But I will give you 30 seconds. And I assure you, I assure you, you can do that. And I assure you it's long enough for good questions. And you as Prime Minister know what it means to have 30 seconds.
That's a sea of time.
That's a sea of time. You will, if you look up the screen, there will be a time, line, if you follow that. And if it's not working, I will, if needed, remind you. As I already mentioned, there's a group of officer cadets up here. Where are you? There's a huge group. Can I just ask you for a first question? Whom of you is going to ask a question? Hello. Could you please say your name?
Good afternoon. My name is Hanneke Oenema.
Hello, Hanneke. Good afternoon. Let me just say, if I'm well informed, as part of the bachelor degree in war studies, you as officer cadets from the Dutch Academy are taking a course on Dutch security and defense. That's true?
Yeah, that's true.
Right. And your course is also, of course, on strategic concept and paper writing on that?
Yeah, that's true.
That's true. I'm saying that because, 30 seconds is otherwise gone. So, your question.
I have a question regarding the Russian-Chinese relationship. As we all know, President Putin and Xi Jinping recently met, and they reaffirmed their support for one another's foreign policy. What could this mean for the international power dynamics, and how should NATO respond to that?
Yes, a very good question, and great that the whole group is here. Very proud of you. I think it underlines the importance of working together, not only within the group of 30 NATO countries, but the fact that we have this cooperation with so many other countries, including, you mentioned China, you mentioned Russia, and Russia is all from Europe up to far into Asia. So this cooperation with countries like Japan, with Korea, but also, of course, New Zealand, Australia, is the more important for this reason. And then I think that cooperation should be as practicable as possible, logistically, but also, for example, in intelligence sharing, in understanding what is happening in all those parts of the world. And at the same time, with China, for example, we have an open relationship. We trade with China, we have dialogues with China. And of course, we have also differences of opinion, for example, on human rights, on Uyghurs, other issues. So I believe you should keep open that relationship with China as much as possible, but at the same time, use that cooperation we have as NATO inside the 30, but also outside the group of 30 with all these countries where we have this cooperation with, and make it very practical. And I think this issue, the visit of Putin to Xi Jinping, underlines the more that importance. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go to another question somewhere up there. Mr. Dean from the Klingendahl Institute. Yes, sing your hand, please.
Yes, Prime Minister, over the last months, NATO and also the Netherlands have very firmly reaffirmed NATO's open door policy and the fact that the Russian Federation has no veto over eventual membership of Ukraine and Georgia. But now, by recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, Russia has a permanent military presence in Crimea and in these republics. To what extent does that influence NATO's decisions and Ukraine's perspective for eventual NATO membership? Thank you.
It should not. And let me tell this to those who are saying that there is now a change or a difference. And we know that Putin basically wants to somehow Finlandize Ukraine, like Finland was in the times of the Soviet Union, Western, the Warsaw Pact NATO times before the Berlin Wall came down. There's one country who decides whether it wants to join NATO or not, and that's Ukraine or Georgia or whatever country. And there are 30 countries, the present member states of NATO, who will decide on membership. And Mr. Putin is not part of the 30, so he has nothing to do with that decision. We have to be very clear.
Thank you very much. Mobdeen, thank you for being here. We've seen you broadcast for these days. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us on Eastern flank in Europe, and you're specialized in that on the Klingendahl Institute. Thank you. Another question. I just raised your hand, so raising your hand, please. Introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Attila Mesterházy, and I'm the Vice President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you very much for this possibility. This crisis shows us that we face as a democracy, an alliance of democracies, a great and serious challenge from autocracies and those who are advocates of illiberalism. Putin is targeting Ukraine because of its people choose the democratic path and the Euro-Atlantic integration. So yesterday we just adopted in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Brussels our contribution to the strategic concept, and we put in the heart of it the democratic values, the shared democratic values. So I would like to ask you, how can we promote and protect, with the help of our partners, this idea that the whole alliance is based on these shared democratic values, which is challenged very much nowadays? Thank you very much.
Now, first of all, you are doing it by being, I believe, the Vice President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And that, for me, underlines and puts in headlines again the fact that NATO is an organization not only targeted on defending what we collectively want to defend, be it our territory or be it in other parts of the world. But NATO is also an organization based on values. It is a corporation based on values. And also in the Dutch new government program and in our traditions, multilateralism, international law. We are in The Hague. The Hague is one of the capitals of the United Nations. This is the international city for the international law, for justice. If we would just be a defense organization, we are the most powerful common defense organization in world history. We have moved beyond the Roman Empire by now. So strong NATO is these days. But if it would only be defense and not values, we would not get there. And the fact that we have a NATO assembly, I'm not sure that the Warsaw Pact, when that existed, had a parliamentary assembly. And if it had one, it had no influence. And that's the difference. And that is why we need NATO, but we need also you guys from our national parliaments who participate in that collective assembly. And thank you for that.
Thank you very much, and I fully agree that NATO Parliamentary Assembly, those members from parliaments coming together from 30 countries is very important, and so thank you coming to the Netherlands today as well, coming to The Hague for that. There are also questions from also, of course, our participants at home, and because there are a lot of people, as I already mentioned in the start of the event, looking from home. As we all know, participants at home, they don't see them, but they do have questions. Can I ask one of the questions, again, Prime Minister?
Yeah.
It's about the how will cyber power drive and guide the actions of states in global politics in the context of rapidly digitizing the world?
Cyber.
Cyber.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's also one of the reasons why we need this new orientation in the next 10 years. And the work Erne Verhagen and the whole group working on the strategy have focused on is of course on the importance of doing more collectively also with our partners outside the NATO 30, but also focusing on hybrid threats, on cyber, and clearly this is not new. I mean, we know it's there now for 10, 20 years, but I think we do realize that we need to do more there. And in that sense, I'm happy that this new strategic orientation of NATO is very much focusing also on these new, not new, but emerging and constantly changing threats. And when we look today, there was just this report coming out of Ukraine that government websites and most of the regional websites in Ukraine hosted by the government were not accessible. Well, of course, this is probably a technological failure. There has nothing to do, I guess, with the speech Putin gave on Monday. But let's assume there is a connection. Then it shows you only how vulnerable we would be if we would not do more in this terrain. And I know that, for example, David van Wil, the Deputy Secretary General, is working on emerging disruptive technologies and how can we also have the technological answers to this, and how can we make use of the best people, be it around Eindhoven, be it around Grenoble, be it around the West Coast in the US, or wherever in NATO territory, to make sure that we have an answer also to these emerging technologies, also from the business perspective.
And particularly young students as well, of course.
Without them, we would be simply dead in the water.
Knowledgeable as all of you are, particularly on the new issues. There's room for two more short questions. Yes, please, up there.
Mr. President.
Your name and affiliation, please.
I'm Slava Krieger, from Second Secretary from the Russian Embassy. And I wanted to ask you, recently we hear more of personal accusations and attacks against our President, Vladimir Putin personally. Why using such a simplification instead of trying to analyze clear Russian national interests? Thank you.
Yes, well, that is a fair question, and I value your presence here today, and the fact that you raise that question. I have had many dealings with Vladimir Putin. When I came into office, I visited him, he visited me, and we built a good personal relationship. That changed, of course, with Crimea in March 2014. And it changed completely after the downing of flight MH17 in July 2014. And still after that, we had many conversations, most of them in German, when we met in international conferences, and we had a chance to talk particularly about the follow-up of MH17. And I think here's somebody who understands clear language. And we have seen that in his speech of last Monday. So I don't think he will get frightened by some strong language. I think he understands that, and it is the best way to deal with the Russian president. So I will continue to do that. But thank you for the question.
Last question for the Young Atlantic, somewhere. The Young Atlantic, where are they? Yes? Please, raise your hand.
Thank you, Prime Minister. My name is Koen Meijering, the chairperson of YAS Netherlands.
Jason?
No, Young Atlantici.
Young Atlantici.
Young Atlantici, great.
You spoke a lot about European, EU and NATO cooperation in your short speech. I was interested to hear how would you think the EU can step up their game in defending our continent? Thank you.
Of course, we need to do more, as I said, on PESCO and other projects. We work together on military mobility and so many other issues where I think the EU could pull more together to leverage more from the collective capabilities we have as a European Union. And that is on the defense side. And as Jens Stoltenberg was saying, complementary to what we do collectively in NATO. The EU is, of course, first of all, a common market with a common currency and, like NATO, common values. And what we need to do more and better, I think, on the European side and within the European Union, is to leverage that part of our assets. To have a higher level of collective wealth creation, competitiveness, etc. And I believe there is so much more we can do, because if we are economically and military more successful as a European Union, of course, primarily focusing on the economic and trade side, then the impact the European Union will have on the world stage will be bigger. because we are more relevant. And that means that we should, of course, stick with the powers of principle, but we should work more on the principles of power. And that means also using our worldwide leverage in terms not only of our economic strengths and trade, but also our collective development aid spending, how we can make sure when we close trade deals with other parts of the world that we uphold our standards. I believe we are doing that better, but still I believe we can do more. So yes, it is working collectively. All the European Union countries were also part of NATO, but also the others. To work on our collective defense, complementary to NATO, but also to be first class as the biggest world trading bloc, being much more effective in leveraging that strength than we are doing currently. And I think we can do more. And I will probably early March deliver a speech where I will talk about that aspect and how that will connect to our power base. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Rutte. I think it was a short time, but a lot of questions, and there's a lot of influence from you taking to the strategic concept in March. And I'm a strong believer, Prime Minister, that this will be the last time you can discuss with students the strategic concept.
Absolutely.
Because I'm sure that some of the organizations around here, from the youth organization and student organization, will invite you to deal and to discuss with you the concept again.
I would love
you emphasized very much on stronger NATO and partnerships. You were very much clear in that. So thank you for that. And we wish you all the best and wisdom as well.
And thank you again for
thank you for
she is one of the was one of the senior members of parliament.
Thank you for
you hosting these events.
Thank you for being
Applause
here.
for you.
Thank you for being here, Prime Minister. Thanks.
Hey.
Dank je.
Fantastisch. Dank je wel.
Dank je wel. Now we're going to have a small intermezzo because they're going to change the stage here for the panel. So I will just go down and ask some of you what your impressions are, and so the cameras will follow. You know, this is always kind of sneaky how this is going to work out, because there's a camera, and participants at home, they might like the color purple, but they might not like my bag and everything, so I'll just try. Okay, I'm so happy to see the delegation of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, because it might that not all of you know how much important it is with 30 countries to have parliamentarians gather together and come together and share, you know, their views. As a former member of parliament and NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I know how important it was for me to meet my colleagues from Estonia, from Finland, from Spain, and all over the world, because through their eyes you see the world. You know, living in the Netherlands, going from north to south in 3 hours and from west to east in 3 hours, we think we know the world, but it's going to be very different. Can I ask you, Ruud Kolen, you're a member of the... Could you please stand up that they can see you? And they like your bag. Yeah, no, they can see you. I think they can see you. Ruud Kolen, you're one of our senators. You're a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. You're also a professor at University of Leiden. What is your reflection on what's going on? And well, you get 2 times 30 seconds.
Well, I think it's a great time to have this meeting here in these very difficult days today. A meeting about NATO, and what I heard in the speeches of the Secretary General and the Prime Minister, but also the question of the young Atlanticists, is the importance of collaboration between European Union and NATO. And there are sort of 2 sides of the same coin, as the Secretary General said. Still, there's a lot of things to do, I would say. We talk about the strategic concept and partnerships between NATO and other countries, but at the same time, European Union is also preparing its own strategic compass in the next few months. And we think that they are can be put together easily, but there are some differences between them. And my wish would be, also for the discussion about a strategic concept, is that how to include also the ideas of the European Union with its own strategic the NATO. For example, if you look at the Western Balkans, It's so important these days that the security is there and that NATO collaborates with them. But there you have some differences. Some countries are partners of NATO, some countries are not members of the European Union. And there's a lot of work to be done also to secure security and defense in the Western Balkans, which is also important for us.
Thanks so much, Ruud Kohler. Can I give the word to Hendrik Blidal, who is also here? He's the Deputy Secretary General of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So he's the one actually who can reflect, if I may ask you, to 30 countries.
Yeah, thank you, Angeline. First of all, glad to be here. Thank you. I didn't know you were here, so good to see you again. The other thing that is really good to see, because the Assembly has put a lot of effort into this, is reaching out to students, to younger generation, to explain what NATO is, what we do, what it is, what it is not, what we stand for, because we are an alliance that stands for something. We stand for values, and it was good to hear all the good comments about shared democratic values, because that's what brings us together. We are an alliance that is not just an alliance that doesn't like Russia. We are an alliance because we are founded on values, and that's what brings us together. So that was great, and we are advocating for a center for democratic resilience, to bring even more democracy and shared values into NATO. So we're looking forward to that when we send our comments to the Secretary General and the countries.
Thanks very much, Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, now we will go to the second part of this event. And I would like the panelists to come in. Please, join us. Hello.
Hey, good to see you.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, please. Well, Mr. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, you just mentioned that the power of politics in European DNA, the Prime Minister said. You will
absolutely.
You will come back to that, I'm sure. Well, we already mentioned that there's serious threat going on in the world. We just discussed that, and we heard that through the speeches of the Secretary General and the Prime Minister. And let me say, we are all delighted to present to you a panel of 4 strong, independent experts from universities and think tanks. They will share with us this afternoon their thoughts of NATO's past, present, and future, and of course, with the emphasis on partnerships. And I'm curious also if you could refer to the speeches you already heard. You're coming from Canada, Ottawa, this morning even. Thank you so much to be with us. From Washington and from Albania. And last but not least, the hometown of Mr. Hoop Scheffer, The Hague.
A 5-minute bike ride.
5 minutes, 5 minutes only. You're biking daily, isn't it? So that makes that you can still do that. Thank you. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, we're delighted to have one of the most knowledgeable persons on NATO in our midst. And we keep saying that because we're all, if I may say, very proud of you as a former Secretary General of NATO, as a former Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and currently you're professor at the University of Leiden, among, I would say, a lot of other activities. And we are happy if you on the broadcast and sharing your valuable knowledge with us. So please, can I ask you your 6 minutes?
Yes.
All of you will have 6 minutes. You have 30 seconds, they have 6 minutes. I'll try to fill the time. Please, and after the panel discussion, of course, with you, with the audience. But come back to that if all of you had their share. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer.
Thank you so much, Angeline. NATO. NATO, of course, has an interesting history. It started, of course, during the Cold War, was very successful, focusing on its core responsibilities, its core task, and I say again, it was successful. Then came, I think, principally after 9/11, a more expeditionary phase of NATO. That was during my mandate as Secretary General of 2004-2009. Afghanistan is a good example. And now, Vladimir Vladimirovich is of course leading to a very strong NATO focus on its core task and core responsibility again. I'm not going to talk at length about Ukraine. We can come back to it during the Q&A, and both the Prime Minister and Secretary Stoltenberg spoke about it. So I'll not dwell too long on it. I must share, nevertheless, a grave concern with you, apart from the political concerns already voiced earlier this afternoon. And my concern is that the relatively rational Vladimir Putin I have met in my NATO days, and I have followed like you afterwards, that relatively rational Vladimir Putin is losing from the raucous, obsessive Vladimir Putin we saw a few days ago. And that is dangerous, because in any conflict, and some of you might remember 1962 Cuba, the missile crisis, finally rationality survived. And my grave concern is that this might not be the case this time. A second observation I would like to share with you is that for the younger generation, for the students here, the word war has come crashing into your generation, as it is again in my generation. I was a young second secretary in the Dutch NATO delegation during the end of the Cold War. We don't have the Cold War back, but we have a situation where war seems to be imminent. And that is a big danger, a big I should say, difference for the younger generation as you have grown up. So this Vladimir Putin, this obsessive and obsessed Vladimir Putin, wants a Yalta 2.0, a Europe with spheres of influence. And that is, as both the Prime Minister and Secretary Stoltenberg have indicated, that is of course not acceptable. Two partnerships. First of all, NATO should adopt and is adapting to a two superpower world. We have all grown up with a one superpower world, the United States of America. We now have clearly two superpowers. And the question, and that's about partnerships, of course, is how global should NATO be? How global should NATO want to be? Yes, and we'll hear more in detail at a later stage. It is, of course, important for NATO, and it was mentioned, to have serious political discussions with countries like Japan, Australia, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, and let me also add India. It wasn't mentioned yet, but India, as China's big regional rival, is a nation, the biggest democracy in the world, we should pay more attention to. Of course, that political dialogue. But when I ask myself and you the question, how global should NATO be? It is also about the question, should NATO as an alliance patrol and guarantee freedom of navigation in the South and East China Seas? Should NATO do that as an alliance? Or should individual NATO allies do that? As we saw a few months ago, when the Queen Elizabeth, the British aircraft carrier, was doing a freedom of navigation operation in that part of the world, accompanied by Dutch and other NATO frigates. A very essential question for NATO. I think if I would ask this question in the United States of America, the jury would still be out. The Americans can tell us, and President Biden could say in the run-up to the strategic concept, you focus on your core task and your own area, the Euro-Atlantic area plus, I would call it, and let us handle the Indo-Pacific. The US could also come to NATO with a message, no, we would like you to have there as an alliance, as a NATO alliance. As I said, the jury is still out. The southern dimension of NATO, the second important partnership region. Classical threats like terrorism, migration, but also hybrid threats like climate change, Africa's demography. NATO there, and then you have, of course, the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. NATO is here confronted with what I think is crucial for your conference tomorrow, and that is, where are NATO's priorities?
Yes.
You cannot have political discussions with each and every single partner. And that is relevant in the southern dimension, where you have the Sahelian zone on the one hand, and you have the Gulf monarchies on the other hand, and all the others, of course. Second basic question with partnerships: are you engaging into these partnerships on a thematic or on a regional geographic basis? When you do it thematic, some partners might have the feeling that they're left out.
Yes.
If you do it on a geographical basis, yeah, you have the need to have them all in. Second fundamental question. Going to the east, it is of course clear that the NATO Ukraine Commission and the NATO Georgia Commission should have all the attention NATO has to give to those two commissions. But I would also specifically mention the Western Balkans. Unstable. Bosnia-Herzegovina is not stable. Ask Mr. Dodik in the Republika Srpska. NATO is still in Kosovo with KFOR. Serbia is sitting on the fence. The European Union, a critical remark, is dragging its feet on the admission of North Macedonia and Albania. And there NATO and the EU, and then I'm coming to a few final remarks,
Please.
Absolutely have common interests. Not only in that area. And that is why, and Jens Stoltenberg said it very clearly, when you discuss partnerships, the partnership between NATO and the European Union is, in my opinion, the most important one. Europe should stand on its own feet militarily, complementing NATO. Article 5 is NATO, but there are many crisis areas and scenarios I can think of that we could not always ring the doorbell of the Oval Office in the White House and tell the Americans, please could you help us out?
Thanks.
So it is very important and very relevant that that partnership should play a crucial and central role in the new strategic concept. And let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Very impressive and food for thought again. Yes, you might give an applause, definitely. Thank you so much. Lauren Speranza, as I'm well informed, you're just coming from the Munich Security Conference?
That's right.
So there's so much to discuss and to share with us. You are the director of the Transatlantic Defense Security Center for European Policy Analysts, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
In Washington, D.C.?
Yeah. You're from Washington, D.C. You also contributed to the expert report 1+4 with the recommendations already to the strategic concept, isn't it? So you're very well informed and prepared for it as well. And your extensive portfolio on publications on deterrence, hybrid threats, NATO and defense technology. The floor is yours. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with so many distinguished panelists and guests. I think we already have a great foundation about partnerships going in our discussion, but I thought maybe I could just zoom out for a little bit to talk about, why do we do these partnerships? And I thought I could offer some ideas and recommendations from the report, which you mentioned. I'm part of this task force back in Washington with Val and some others, led by Dan Hamilton. And the report that we just released talks a little bit about how to think about partnerships in this era. And the first thing is kind of organizationally thinking about what types of partnerships we do. And there is a first group of partners that you could think about as countries that might like to become members of the alliance one day. So Ukraine and Georgia, of course, come to mind. And for them, partnerships are a tool to help them prepare for eventual membership. And here, I think it's really terrific to highlight that it's so wonderful that nations are lining up to join the alliance. And, nobody is lining up to join Russia in that way. And this really just underscores the importance of the alliance and its enduring relevance. Nobody at the Munich Security Conference was talking about NATO being brain dead anymore. The relevance is really palpable. So these partnerships are a way for countries to continue modernizing and working towards this goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. But I think there's also two other groups that are valuable partners for NATO. One of those groups is countries in NATO's periphery to the south, which you mentioned, that might not want to become NATO members, but could have practical benefits for cooperating with NATO. And then there's another group that are countries that also do not wish to become NATO members right now, but already very closely contribute to NATO's and transatlantic security, like Finland and Sweden. And those are important for a couple of reasons that have already been touched upon, but just to very quickly summarize, there's a political component here to help reinforce NATO's core values in this fundamental struggle that we're having between democracy and authoritarianism. Partners can help shift the balance of power towards NATO's core values of democracy and rule of law. There's a security component because they contribute to NATO operations and missions and help foster interoperability so we can all work together to solve global crises. And then there's a stability component about empowering and building capacities of partner countries in volatile regions so that they are better empowered security contributors and can help address threats before they even reach NATO's borders. Now, of course, as we've mentioned, NATO can't afford to partner with every country all the time. And I think one of the challenges we've seen so far is that it just demands a lot of resources and staff and time to make partnerships actually happen and make them fruitful. So now, as part of the strategic concept, we've been debating a lot, how do we make these partnerships more effective with limited resources? And I think there are three ideas that we have been discussing, especially in Washington. And some of these are reflected in the Reflection Group report as part of the NATO 2030 process. But the first is to change the way partnerships are approached. So being more intentional and deliberate about the way we do partnerships. Right now, we kind of have a demand-driven approach where basically partners raise their hand and they determine, kind of this is the scale of partnership we want to have, this is what we want to do with NATO. And we need to move instead towards more of an interest-based approach where NATO is proactively reaching out to partners and deciding what it wants to do with these partners and prioritizing based on its strategic needs and its resources. So one thing NATO can do there is have a more systematic mapping exercise with very clear goals and trying to have a more impact-based approach. The next thing we can do is change the way partnerships are funded. So right now, we could really benefit from more predictable and stable resources. We rely a lot on something NATO calls trust funds, which are basically kind of limited funding and also voluntary national contributions of personnel, and they're quite limited. So that means that partnerships don't always have the resources they need, and it also limits NATO's ability to kind of adapt its partnerships when circumstances change. For example, what's happening right now in Ukraine, we don't have a lot of resources and staff freed up to make those changes. So being more creative about how we fund partnerships. And lastly, just building on what Mr. Tuhub-Skeffer said already, is trying to engage more on thematic issues, cross-cutting challenges, rather than just geographic groupings of partners. And I think as we go forward, we're going to continue to face complex, simultaneous crises happening across domains, happening all across the world. And really, our ability to prevail is going to be based on our ability to have coalitions of willing and capable partners that can assemble very quickly and are highly interoperable. All of their capabilities can work together. So moving towards a more flexible approach for partnerships, I think has to be the way to go. And the final thing I'll say, I know I'm almost out of time, but just a very quick question, which I think is on everyone's mind. What can we do for partners like Ukraine that they have a partnership with NATO, but short of Article 5 or membership, what can we do? One of the ideas that came out of this task force report was the idea for a Ukrainian Deterrence initiative, which would essentially be an extension of Ukraine's Enhanced Opportunity Partnership, which it already has. And it basically would just make it a strategic responsibility for NATO to do everything it can, short of providing an Article 5 guarantee, to equip Ukraine through more military equipment, more defensive weapons, more training, but also more ad hoc consultations by upgrading the NATO Ukraine Commission, giving Ukraine more access to the centers of excellence across the alliance and common funding, things like that can help us bolster Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, because clearly Russia is using this as a testing ground to see what it can get away with. And so how we respond here is going to be so important for the future.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you very much. You shared a few creative thoughts with us, but also a very important question is what can we do for partnerships? I think that's very much on the table today, and I'm sure questions will come about that, but that's on the table today in everybody's mind. I'd like to go to you, Jonathan. Jonathan Berkshire-Miller, you are the Director and Senior Fellow of the MacDonald-Laurie Institute. You're very much focused on Indo-Pacific, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
That's part of your expertise?
Yes.
For a while already. And also, of course, on the intelligence issues in the northeast of Asia. That's your expertise as well. And you're an advisory to the Canadian federal government.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much for being here all the way from Canada to share your thoughts with us on a stronger NATO and partnerships. please.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure. Anytime I can escape the ice and the snow of Canada in the middle of winter to join you fine
The rainy
folks.
Netherlands.
Yeah, well, it was a beautiful day today. Well, thank you again so much. And as you mentioned, Angeline, I'm going to focus most of my discussion on the Indo-Pacific and some of the partnerships. And I think some of the panelists, in addition to the Prime Minister and the Secretary General, have already talked about the 4 key partners that NATO has in this region, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. But I think the bigger question that you might be asking, and I think Ukraine has come up a lot, and rightfully so, the security crisis we're having right now in Europe, is why the Indo-Pacific? Why are we talking about the Indo-Pacific right now? And to start that, I want to give you a little bit of an anecdote of when I was in Japan and some of the discussions that were happening when Crimea's illegal annexation happened. And at this time, former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was sort of not necessarily a bromance, but he was having multiple meetings with Vladimir Putin because they have a territorial dispute in the north. So there was a motivation to resolve that territorial dispute. So once the annexation of Crimea happened, he was kind of caught in a bind, you know, what's going to happen with this negotiation that's happening on our territorial dispute. But I think eventually Japan took the position, and I think others in the Indo-Pacific also took this position, that we need to come down hard on this. And why is that? Because this is not just a European issue. This is an international rules-based order issue. The idea that a state, and I believe one of the panelists mentioned might makes right, the idea that a state can unilaterally change the status quo just because they want or just because they feel like it has profound implications for states in the Indo-Pacific. So I would urge you to resist the temptation of seeing these as sort of separate theaters that are disconnected. And on that point, actually, just this past week, we saw the Russian Navy have one of its largest ever exercises in the Pacific Ocean at the same time that the crisis was happening in Europe. So these are very much connected spheres. The second reason why I think we need to be thinking a lot about the Indo-Pacific partners, and again, I was very happy to see the discussion that you mentioned on India, because it doesn't need to be limited only to the 4 key partners. I would mention Mongolia as another partner that NATO's been working with, is that the global threats and global challenges that we face and increasingly will face, whether this is on cyber, whether this is on space, climate change, these do not respect the borders or the geographies or the notions that we have in our mind of where they should be confined to. This is something we absolutely need to be working with partners in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. This is not something that can just be dealt with through the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. That being said, of course, the caveat is there that NATO is an alliance that's focused on Europe and the Atlantic, and that's okay. But in order to meet some of these challenges of the day, it's going to be very, very important to bolster partners, and I think the Indo-Pacific is going to be key for that. The third key point, and this is something as someone who travels in this part of the world a lot, is the Indo-Pacific, frankly, is not the transatlantic, and not just from geography terms, but from an architecture perspective. You have NATO. We're having this great discussion. We have years of experience, the good, the bad, sometimes the ugly, not so much ugly. But in the Indo-Pacific, there isn't that sort of architecture. We do not have the multilateral architecture. It's been held up on bilateral alliance networks and basically a spaghetti bowl of many lateral relationships. So in order to ensure that the rules-based order is maintained in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to take a village, frankly. And NATO is welcome in that tent as well, in whichever form that takes. And the last point that I'll leave you on, and I think especially because some of the students we have in the crowd, and we've already heard some really excellent questions, is that civil society has a role here too. I often think when we talk about whether it's partners in the Indo-Pacific or partners in Europe, it's that it's everything's on the shoulders of the government. Track one must make decisions on it. But civil society plays an extremely important role. And I would say some of the most creative solutions, ideas, policy options, and recommendations that I've seen on this particular topic have come from the universities, have come from the think tanks, have come from networks that are outside of government. So this is a point for everyone in the audience that's interested in this topic in particular, whether it's NATO partnerships or NATO in the Indo-Pacific. I'd urge you to put forward your great ideas because we desperately need them. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks so much. And also, particularly what you just mentioned, emphasizing on civil society is a very important one. So that we will come back through questions and answers, I'm sure. Valbona Sanelli, welcome.
Thank you.
You are the chair of the Strategic Initiatives Department at the George Marshall European Center for Security Studies. And I think you've done this for several years already, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. You're an economist, international relations advisor to the Albanian government and private sector. And if I just looked around, the ambassador of Albania to the Netherlands was also yesterday. Good to see her. You also did research on international economics and security studies. And like you, Lauren, you also worked on the 1+4 report. So you share that. Can I please give you the floor?
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here in this great auditorium and with such a distinguished panel. So really, I come from the Marshall Center, who's a cooperation between the German and the US government. I'll be speaking here as a scholar, but it's great, really great to be here. So I'd like to, in my points, I'm going to focus on a very important question that was raised from the Vice President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the issue of democratic resilience. I think recent events in the world are driving home the reality that strategic competition is centering increasingly more into different forms of governance. And I think, we are in that bipolar perspective now between democracy and autocracy. I'm afraid that in the last 10 years, we have seen a rise in autocracy where our adversaries are even selling it as efficient. And unfortunately, there are people around the world, even in NATO countries, that are buying that narrative. And so this might be a good case even to be made that we're not doing enough in terms of building democratic resilience. When I say that, I mean that the discipline of reminding people why it is important, why values matter, why rule of law matters, why strong institutions matter, why respecting human rights matter. And so, of course, at the end, why democracy, although we know sometimes can be really messy, is much better than autocracy. So the importance of the why is that our competitive advantages are mainly our democratic values that have enabled our way of life and our economic prosperity. And this is something that we need to remind to ourselves and even communicate it to our publics. Democratic resilience is really important to defending that. This is the why. This is why it's important, to defending our way of life, to defend our prosperity. But we cannot do that overnight. It's not something that you can just, surge it. It has to be done continuously. It has to be done 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's something that needs to be reminded. And so the question is how? How do we defend then our prosperity? I'll recommend 3 things that we need to do. First is demonstrate resilience, unity, and autonomy. And starting with resilience, NATO and the transatlantic community really should develop and sustain a comprehensive approach when it comes to resilience, going from physical resilience to societal resilience to resilience of our democratic processes. And when it comes to partnerships, it's very important that this way of working in our countries, within our countries, so we talk about shared resilience, it has to then become a forward resilience in the sense that we use the same practices of working and push those resilient standards to our partner nations. The second point is really the importance of the unity of purpose and unity of efforts, because these are the most important things when it comes to us, the Western countries, NATO countries, exercising the influence in the rules-based order, if we really want to preserve it. And in the same way, we need to continue and integrate our partners into this community of free market democracies, free market economies. So partners will improve their capacities, their development, and then eventually they will become net contributors when it comes to providing more prosperity and security. And then the third point is really relates to the fact that we need together as NATO members, but also together with partners, sustain and practice our collective autonomy when it comes to the freedom of the seas, space, when it comes to the information world, when it comes to cybersecurity, and all the other new challenges that we're seeing. So what should we do then? It's very important that we need a coherently integrated strategic approach when it comes to partnerships. Partnerships across all sectors, not only when it comes to defense and military. But to do that and to bring the partners into our own community, I think we need to understand and set priorities first, confront the priorities with the partners' priorities too, and then allocate resources to those priorities. In the case that we do not have enough resources, and that's usually always the case, then really we need to collectively manage risk and then understand the progress, but also understand the limits that our partners have when it comes to the absorptive capacities. So really help the partners in raising those absorptive capacities so they can achieve and absorb our standards, our norms, our rules. So in the case of NATO, and a lot was discussed, so I do not want to repeat things, but I think it's very important to use partnerships more strategically, prioritize those that advance the alliance interest, really put democratic resilience at the core, at the heart of all partnerships, and then extends partnerships, it was mentioned, to the new challenges from cyber to disruptive technologies to climate change, and also to the global commons. And an important issue that was raised more times today was the importance of NATO EU collaboration. And that is key because of our joint resources. We do not have enough resources to do everything on our own. So it's very important that, we bring these together, and we can discuss also maybe on some practical examples that you could bring up on how to better collaborate, have a better collaboration between NATO and the EU. Another important point that was mentioned is also partnering with civil society and the business community. I think NATO needs to start looking more into, broadening the partnerships. And so I think I will close with what I started with, the why, that this is the noble purpose of partnering. Really, how to unify the community of like-minded, democratic nations and people all around the world that really create that strong future of the democratic world in this bipolar strategic competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albona. Thank you. As already mentioned, this is an excellent panel, and the way the four of you approached the theme of the stronger NATO and partnerships is very useful. And we just go straight to, without further ado, to questions and answers, of course. And let me take 3 questions in a row and ask you again to say your name, your affiliation, and the 30 seconds. Whom of you first? At the back, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Albion Tusha. I'm an Albanian student here in the Netherlands. My question is focused here on the Western Balkans. The region has been unstable historically, and the stability currently is very dependent on NATO. Do you believe that the region's stability is too dependent on NATO? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's even 20 seconds. The second question, also at the back.
Yes, thank you. My name is Christian van Ravels. I'm a military working student with the Dutch MOD. It's called Defense College. Not many of you have probably heard of it, but it's actually really interesting. But my question is, do you think it is wise to continue bilateral initiatives within NATO, such as the German-Netherlands Corps or the Dutch-Belgian Admiralty? Don't you think it will cause some mutual biases within NATO? Thank you.
Thanks. Very good questions from the Defense College. The third question up there. I don't know if there's a mic around. Yes, thanks.
Hi. Thank you. My name is Tjeerd Kruijt. I work as a security risk consultant. Of course, we watched a very alarming speech 2 days ago of Mr. Putin, in which he sometimes directly threatened former Eastern Bloc states. And also, in the Netherlands, we heard threats regarding the use of nuclear weapons. To what extent should an increase in nuclear deterrence in Europe could contribute to that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. 3 questions. One about the Western Balkans, closely cooperation between Germany and the Netherlands, and the nuclear approach. Mr. Opschevers, can I ask you first? And then I'll just give you the word as well.
All right, thank you. I do very much agree with the analysis our Albanian friend made from the back. Yes, I think indeed the region is too dependent on NATO. I think NATO should stay there. NATO can't leave. But as I said in my brief introduction, in my opinion, this is a matter where the European Union should get more serious vis-à-vis the Western Balkans. And I think that Serbia, as I said, is sitting on the fence. The Chinese are very active in the region. The Russians are very active in the region. I have seen Saudi influence. In other words, there's a lot of work to do for the European Union. But as long as the European Union, and that has to do with the public opinion, of course, which is very critical, including in my own country, the Netherlands. As long as public opinion is very critical, governments are dragging their feet, in my opinion, because stability in that region, in my opinion, meets the end goal of Euro-Atlantic integration. And that process should be speeded up, in my opinion. I'll leave the other questions to my colleagues on the panel. But as far as European defense is concerned, it is essential that form of bilateral cooperation between the Dutch and the Germans, a German-Netherlands core. A European army, it will not come. A European army in the sense that you have a big, broad European army. And the European Union should, as the Prime Minister said very clearly, cannot, in my words, always ring the doorbell when there's a crisis in the Western Balkans or in the Sahelian zone or whatever. So I think the only way to go for the moment is strong bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral cooperation between individual nations. And that all, of course, in complementarity of what the North Atlantic Alliance is doing. Let me stop here because I take the
Thanks. Lauren, you like to?
Sure. Maybe I'll just quickly build with a point on each of these. So I completely agree. The Western Balkans, I think they have been overlooked for far too long. If we're going to compete anywhere, we keep talking about this era of strategic competition, it must be there. That is the front line of freedom, of European security in so many ways. And it's a perfect place for NATO and the EU to be cooperating more together on both, security sector reform, on institution building, on values, on all of these things. On the point about bilateral initiatives, I completely agree. I think rather than creating biases, I actually think it strengthens the alliance because you can't do everything with every ally all the time. And to have concrete things that we can work on in smaller groups, we now hear this term called mini-laterals. So not necessarily an entire multilateral institution, but smaller groups of willing and capable nations. I think that's the future when nations have the capabilities and the willingness to come together. So I think that's a good development. And finally, just on nuclear, I'm sure others have thoughts, but I think this is going to continue to be a major concern. The Secretary General of NATO has consistently reinforced that, as long as nuclear weapons are out there, NATO is going to continue to be a nuclear alliance. I know there's a lot of concerns about Russia's kind of abandoning of many of the arms control regimes that we have out there, and I think there's a need to restart that conversation to account for new types of weapons and also for new actors. But I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jonathan. Could you add to that?
Sure. Yeah. Excellent questions. In the interest of time, just one quick point on Christian's great question from the Defense College. So, I would agree with my colleagues on this. really, if you think about multilateral relationships, at their core, what really are they? They are a web of bilateral relationships. So it's fundamental in order to grow these organizations, to have that trust, in addition to the shared interests that they have, is to build those relationships. I do understand the sort of the angle that you're getting at and the idea of sort of overweighting in one sort of area, but I think it's fundamental to these organizations growing to have those tight bilateral bonds. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Fabona.
So maybe a lot was mentioned. I'll start with the question on the Western Balkans. It's important. The Western Balkans is Europe's front yard, not backyard, as it used to, be called a long time ago. But I should also remind that there has been progress there. So you have 3 NATO member countries: Albania, North Macedonia, and Montenegro. So becoming, really net contributors and supporting NATO. But what is important, I think, also in the future, it was mentioned the EU integration is crucial. Unfortunately, the enlargement fatigue in the European Union countries has created that reform fatigue in the region. And that's why I think the role of NATO in collaboration with the European Union is even more important, going from democratic resilience to strengthening institutions to fighting corruption, but also in other areas. So I'd like to bring another one that could be used in the Western Balkans, but maybe in other places too. So in the future, there is discussion between NATO and the European Union to look at the FDI screening mechanism, the foreign direct investment screening mechanism in Europe. And of course, the European Union has the lead function into that, but also NATO can do a lot. I think that is a program, a platform that should be extended also to the Western Balkans that are not EU member states. That's important because of the role of the new players in the region, China, Russia, and the others. So these are the practical areas that we can collaborate with the Western Balkans. And just one point that was, I completely agree when it comes to bilateral relations. More bilateral relations, we better understand each other. There's more trust among each other. But then the last point will be regarding the importance of NATO, not only when it comes to nuclear, capabilities and arms and others, but also technological edge. That is crucial. What should we do together jointly in order to increase and have NATO always at the forefront of the technological advancement when it comes to the defense industries?
Thank you so much for your answers. I was just listening and thinking, how are we going to coordinate all of this? Because that's I think, very important. But let me first go to the next row of questions. 3 more questions. So many. Up there, 2, and up there, please. Yep. The mic is coming to you. Please, your name.
Hi, thank you.
Yep.
My name is Mike Heuveld. I'm a student at Leiden University. So my question is, we heard from the panel a lot about democratic values and that NATO should maybe advance those when it chooses partnerships abroad. But my question would be, if you advance this narrative, will it not exclude a lot of countries which we might have strategic interests aligned with, like the UAE, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There's, question up there, and then we go up. Your name.
Hello, my name is Axel Lang. I'm also a student at Leiden University. Apologies for the outfit. I left my suit in Brussels. In terms of international partnerships, as a former naval officer, I deployed to South America, and I spoke a lot there with stakeholders who were concerned about their overt approaches to being closer to NATO and the EU, and their increased expansion of military capability, especially naval, going from green water navies to blue water navies. Do you see that as interesting for NATO? Because so far there's only Colombia that's been accepted as a partner.
Thanks. 3rd question. Your name, please.
Hello, my name is Gilberto Morishaw. I'm a fellow for the German Marshall Fund, TILN. The question that I have is actually related to democratic decay. We're currently seeing globally, especially in NATO countries, a huge democratic decay and autocratic behaviors within our own populations. How do we expect to create partnerships based on democratic values if we're not willing to target these issues in our own countries?
Thank you so much. I'll start with you, Valbona.
Well, great questions. Thank you very much. And I'll start from the last question. It has to start with us. It has to start inside our countries when it comes to, democratic resilience. And that's why I mentioned from the very beginning. So we need to remind people why this is important. I think for a very long time in many NATO countries, we're taking it for granted. We cannot even understand the why anymore, that is the basis of the way that we live. Of our prosperity. So you're right. It needs to start in the NATO countries, and that's why, and then, in collaboration among each other, that's why the shared, democratic resilience. And then after we really have a strong one, then we push it and, we extend it and support other like-minded partners to raise capacities when it comes to democratic developments. There was a question regarding also different other NATO partners. NATO has more partners than members. And of course, more times it was mentioned that a lot of partnerships will be regional, thematic, on different issues. So we don't, of course, this is, when we strive about democratic, and we talk about democratic resilience, I think we strive for good governance. We strive for strong institutions, for rule of law, and all these others that make, our society strong. The question regarding, why we're having this democratic decay, it's disinformation campaigns. So we do need to do a better job also when it comes to the information space, and support not only our own institutions, strengthen our own institutions, but also then support others. And then for this reason, I think, centers of excellence of NATO when it comes to democratic resilience, but also communication, strategies and all that will be important, because that will also help the other partners to push those ideals.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, do you want to add to that?
Sure.
I think your words about we're taking it for granted. We take our security for granted. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer mentioned that every year to Parliament, and it's so true. We're taking security for granted. We're taking NATO for granted without knowing actually that we are NATO. But please, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, excellent questions, and I would agree with Valbona on many of her points, and I agree it starts at home. I mean, I think when talking about democratic resilience and other issues, I wanted to touch on the partnership element, and some very good questions. Whether it's in Latin America, another question there was focused on the partnerships in the Middle East. Obviously, I focused in my remarks on partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and I think what's coming out of this, whether it's thematic, whether it's regional, whether it's country by country, is that there is no one shoe that fits each partnership. And I think that we're going to see increasingly as NATO looks to different partners. I think they should be looking increasingly at partners in Latin America, for example. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the exact same equivalence as a partnership would be with Japan, for example, or with South Korea or with Australia. So I think we very much need to think about the needs and the strengths of each individual partner and where NATO can work with them. So rather than thinking of this as one sort of category, you're in the group, you have to match these 5 sort of category options. I think it needs to be much more flexible.
Thanks. You want to add to that? Briefly.
I'll briefly pick up on just the last question about, how do we tackle these issues at home about reinforcing our values? I think one of the questions that comes up a lot in this debate is, when you have allies that do not adhere to these values, do you enforce punitive measures on them or some kind of way to enforce these things at home? And I think there's a lot of skepticism in the alliance about what if NATO were to get involved with domestic political issues like that. It could be very damaging to alliance cohesion. And I think there is much more focus on how do we use centers of excellence and other things to promote good standards rather than punish within the alliance. So I would just offer that as a consideration.
Thanks a lot.
Let me make it a bit complicated.
I'm expecting that from you, please.
Because I mentioned that we have to mentally and politically adapt to a 2 superpower world. Having experience with the 1 superpower world, the United States of America. Now we have a 2nd superpower, the Chinese, who simply tells us and tells me, human rights? Come on, our model is far superior to yours. And that becomes, and that's why I'm saying I'm making it complicated, that is difficult because we in the West have called the shots for not only for decades, but for centuries. And now there's a second superpower who says, forget it, we have 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps, or you can use even stronger expressions, and that's a far superior model. So resilience and that debate is more relevant than ever. I fully agree. Where it gets, I'll show a second complication because when you are calling the shots, you are faced with complications on human rights. Very briefly, over Afghanistan, all air traffic was controlled by Qatar, the huge airbase near Doha in Qatar. And there were many soldiers, and those soldiers did things they should not do, also outside the base. And then they were picked up by the police. And then the Qataris said, Sharia law. It was not on the base. And then I had to phone the then Crown Prince, present Emir of Qatar, as a NATO Secretary General. And then I must admit, I consider that not the moment to give the Deputy Emir, the Crown Prince of Qatar, a lecture on human rights, because I'll know I will not succeed. Yeah. But nevertheless, they should know, also the Qatari with a different system. I'm polite as always, with a different system, is a valued, highly valued NATO partner. That goes for the Saudis and that goes for the debate with the Chinese as well. So yes, more relevant than ever. Also in our own societies, in this country, where we have that, we need that debate very much, because I'm not saying autocracy is coming up in the Netherlands, but populism definitely is. So I mean, it's a complicated field of action, and I'm not sorry to say that in the course of my career I have becoming in international relations terms more a realist than a constructivist.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, but that's the way it is.
Thank you very much, Jaap, for adding that. We go to the last row for 3 questions. Let me see. Let me take that row there, 3, please. Yep. Your name, please.
Thank you. My name is Casper Hanenpoel, and I'm a student at Leiden University as well. Mr. De Hoop Scheffer, you mentioned the need of Western politicians to carry out stronger power politics. Looking at the current situation in Ukraine, do you think the decision by Western leaders to rule out military intervention is a good way to bolster this strategy?
Thank you, Casper. Next question, also up there. Yes, please. Yeah, please.
I'm Ruud Kaspari, retired with a background in the Navy and NATO. A few days ago, the French Chief of Defense visited the Dutch Chief of Defense, and they discussed about potential together going to Romania. Quite interesting. Should that be under NATO auspices or under EU auspices, given the fact that the political background of our Minister of Defense? Thank you.
Thank you. Last question. Who? Yep. Up there. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I am Ahmed, and I am also a Leiden University student. I study security studies. My question here is because you raised the importance of democratic values, and my question is, why doesn't the EU take a bigger role in supporting such countries like in the Middle East to effectively transform their regimes to be democratic and support the civil society there in a way that suits the values of the people in the region, instead of making it like more like Western values? Because apparently the lack of stability and freedom in the region is affecting the EU when it comes like to migration and all of the stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Lauren, starting with you.
Okay, maybe I'll pick up on the question about sending things to Romania and some of the deterrence issues. I would say I think the EU plays a very strong role in encouraging investment in those types of capabilities, but I think deployability, can come through NATO, and I think we've seen a great progress already with deploying troops through the NATO framework, deploying equipment to the region, building up deterrence. I think that's a core responsibility for NATO. We unfortunately have not seen the EU battle groups and those types of things ever deployed yet, and so I think that's kind of an area for NATO for now.
Thank you. Jonathan.
I'll just have a quick comment on the very good question about the Middle East. And those who sort of have a military background are familiar with the term mission creep too. And not to say that those conversations can't be had in a NATO context and that can't be something that can be discussed. But there are a range of different institutions, international institutions, some of them not even government institutions, that can also have those discussions at the same time. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about how many different buckets NATO gets into as well. So that I think it's not something we should take off the table, no. But I think there is capacity issues.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
On the question on power politics, look, the European Union is a soft power union in a hard power environment. The European Union was not the European Union idea. European Economic Community idea was not about hard power, was not about military. But under present circumstances, and we have given the reasons from the panel, the EU is forced to think about, despite its DNA, to think about hard power projection. I think the EU is not ready yet, as we speak, but that discussion should be strengthened, in my opinion. Because I say again, we have always relied on the Americans, and that was fine. It was financially fine. We could go to the beach and have a glass of pina colada, and the Americans did the hard job and were working. That was basically the scenario. That can't be done anymore, also because the Americans themselves, starting with Obama, continuing under Trump, and now with Joe Biden, are saying, excuse us, but we are not the world's policemen anymore. We're not going to see our people and our soldiers, our GIs die in any place in the world. So the European Union will have to grow accustomed to power politics. But, here comes the but, and here comes NATO, of course. That is not relevant and will not be relevant for any scenario linked to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Ukraine is NATO at the moment. Ukraine is not the European Union. Although, I add, that I think when it comes to the crunch, Putin fears the European Union more than he fears NATO. He knows that NATO is not going to wage war over Ukraine, but he doesn't want the European Union, democracy, values, coming closer to his border. That is the risk for his regime. When Ukrainians become Poles, like they have seen Poland develop, when Poland acceded to the European Union. So in that regard, the European Union has an enormous strength, and indeed should use it. But be a bit careful to use it in the full in some areas. Middle East is a very sensitive area in that regard.
Thanks.
On the question, and then I'll stop on about the French Chief of Defense, the French CHOT. I would hope that such an initiative would be part of NATO in the sense that it would strengthen, as Lauren was saying, it would strengthen the eastern flank. I think in the European Union you would never have political support for such a mission. The alternative, of course, would be, and it was mentioned, I think earlier in the panel, a coalition of the willing. But my strong preference, of course, would be NATO.
Thank you so much. Falbona, the last word.
Maybe I'll take the question regarding the Middle East countries. I agree that sometimes we in the European Union myopically focus only on the consequences, and that was migration crisis in 2015, 2016. And we forget to really look deeply into the root causes. That goes back into bad governance that becomes a liability. And so a better focus on those issues, I think it's important for the future, because there's a lot of funding that the European Union has, given to those countries. And so it's also an issue of accountability, because it's European Union member states and people, taxpayers' money. So we have to be more accountable how that money is spent. And I think, unfortunately, not only in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in the Western Balkans and some other areas, sometimes the process has been elite-focused, elite-driven. I think we need to broaden it up and include more civil society, young people, business community to that process of capacity building. And last point regarding Ukraine, that's a little bit different. I think, the best deterrence of the West when it comes to Russia is really the unity of the West, the unity of the European Union, and also the unity of the transatlantic community. I think that one of the biggest unintended consequences of the invasion in 2014 of Crimea was really the creation of the integrity of the national identity of the Ukrainians. And so this is, I think, keeping this unity in the future will be key as the best deterrent.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to you as panelists and participants this afternoon. And the time was not limited this afternoon because we were together again after, I would say, more than 2 years after lockdown to discuss, and your valuable solutions and your suggestions will be taken tomorrow in the seminar with policymakers and, of course, with the NATO representatives. We heard so much about security this afternoon, about resilience and NATO partnerships and how to coordinate and how to come up with policies on that. There's so much going on, particularly this time and today and yesterday. Before we will leave and before we have to wrap up, I will ask Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, you of all, could you please in 2 minutes give a wrap up this afternoon? You can do that.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
It's not 30 seconds,
that's the reason
2
you
minutes.
saw me nervously scribbling on these pieces of paper because the question had been
no one can do much better than Jaap de Hoop Scheffer.
Listen. What the takeaway I have from my colleagues and from the questions. First of all, partnerships means setting priorities. Not easy for NATO because we have many partnerships. Partnerships means a choice between thematic, coalition of the willing, or regional. Partnership means perhaps changing the way we do it, not extending our hand and say, "Oh, please come." What is your own initiatives? Partnership, there is a difference between the transatlantic, where we are used to, the majority of these people are used to, and it was good that we heard that such an architecture does not exist in the Indo-Pacific region. And when I say Indo-Pacific, we should really talk about the Indo-Pacific. It is not only China, not only the 4 partners we are already talking to, but I repeat, it is also India. Civil society and resilience. Civil society and resilience. I think I should read the plea made by Val is that we are not resilient enough, and that we should give more impetus and spend more energy on resilience, defending our own values and explaining what they mean, explaining what an institutional rules-based international order means, explaining what democracy means, explaining what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights means already from I think 1948 or 49. In a world where autocracy is on the rise, and we should be very careful that democracy is not weakened. In brief, answering the question why values matter. We have heard about the need for partnerships. We've also heard, by the way, that NATO has many. I'm not going to say perhaps too many, but it will be awfully difficult, and I speak from experience, to manage all those partnerships as far as manpower is concerned, as far as financing is concerned. So there's really a lot to do. And last but certainly not least, when you look at the partnerships, and then again, I'm of course a NATO man. When you talk about partnerships, that relationship with the European Union is extremely important for all of us. If you are in the Indo-Pacific or you're here, it is extremely important. And I hope that the political hurdles, Angeline, you know also so well from your political past in Parliament and being still active in the same sphere, how difficult it is and how big the hurdles from time to time are. talking about resilience, we should also be very resilient in bringing that cooperation together. Thank you very much, Angeline. This was it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists because, after all, it's all about partnership, I would say. And that's what you just clearly mentioned to all of us and brought up to the audience and to students around us. And I think that's so important message because NATO is not somewhere in Brussels. We are NATO ourselves. If we talk about NATO, it's about us. So let's say NATO is about us. So once again, thank you very much. Thanks.
A big applause for our moderator, Angeline.
We keep applauding now, I think, because we're so happy to see each other again after all those months on the screen to see each other. Can I also say thank you to all those with us from the home and from the office and those around the world. We took some of your questions, not all of them. I can show you the participants at home, they had 3 scores of questions. Same as you probably had somewhere. But next time, I would say. Thank you once again so much. We all know that security doesn't stay by itself. We are and we should be very responsible for that. And yeah, that's what you mentioned to parliamentarians as me for a long time through all those years. And you keep repeating that. And that's the strength that brings us all together. And we should carry that on. So thank you so much. And I think we had a very valuable afternoon in this seminar. The Prime Minister already mentioned, seminars don't come out of the air. They're organized by people. And there's a huge team. Can I just look around? Where's the team who organized this? They are somewhere. But where they are, could they please stand up at least? Wendela and others. And could we give them a big applause? Because up there, yes. I have to share with you that there are 8 people, 10 people just at the back to organize all the technicalities all around here. You can see that cameras without those people around couldn't be there. There's so much, and there was so much flexibility from the team because this morning didn't know if the Secretary General was around, if Mark Rutte would be around. And it was hour by hour changing the program. And a big thanks to you and a big applause we did already, but that's very important. So thank you so much. Safe trip home to all of you. Can I invite the first 2 rows to go at the back first, and those who invited for dinner in the Art Kunstmuseum, you're very welcome there already. Once again, safe trip home, and let's continue with NATO Stronger Together with partnerships, and we are NATO. Back home.
然後應該係一個 barcode 嘅啫，所有嘅個人資料都係喺香港。
由於普篩後勢必有大量民眾需要隔離，大陸因此決定幫香港新建方艙醫院展